Excerpt from the Massetti Prime Gazette, translated to human units based on your location. Dear readers, have you ever watched a disaster unfold right in front of your eyes? It really is a macabre sort of fascinating. You can't help but stare entranced, unable to look away, the whole time wondering, how bad is this going to get and how you are going to survive. Such was my bewilderment as I set my gaze upon the unbelievable human activity that is revolution. A revolution, you ask? Yes, dear readers, a revolution. A large systematic rebuke of civil law. The anger of the masses come to a boil against society itself. And humans are really, scarily, good at it. But Heltel, you exclaim, everything you've written about humans so far has led me to believe that these humans live in a wonderful societal utopia, not entirely dissimilar to our greater galactic core. How could you have misled me so? And to that, I reply simply. What in the names of the great and many heavens led you to believe that a species that throws themselves out of flying airships for fun would have a grand, stable, and unified system of governance across their many scores of independent colonies? Humans are apparently biologically incapable of agreeing on how to govern themselves. Just about the only thing they do agree on is the idea that they will never agree on anything political. Unlike some species that biologically organize into hives, or others that have mostly just wandered into one fashion or another and stuck with it. Humans more or less said, literally everyone else is wrong, this is how it's done, and then forcibly took power and ruled until the next bunch of humans comes along. Which is probably sometime next week. In summary, some systems last for longer than others, and some seem to only inspire a never-ending cycle of violent succession. Yours truly happened to find a front row seat to one such less than peaceful event. And before you skip to the end of the article, looking for helpful tips, my advice to anyone in a similar situation is simple. Get off planet. Out of the sector is better. Moving from story to story, I had taken up the practice of hanging around the different popular gathering locations in the city or station I was currently in after work. It's nice to get to talk with people outside of a formal context, and it gives me a great perspective on exactly how diverse humanity can be. One week I'll be exploring a casino with a millionaire, and the next I will find myself in the only tavern in a mining station. In this instance, it happened to be one of those that got me in trouble. Dmitry Korda owned a large stake of a recently developed asteroid mining operation in the outer reaches of Jebskir-2, a human territory that consisted of nothing but metal-rich asteroids, and far from anyone else, which was exactly how Dmitry wanted it. We were currently discussing the current commodities market for heavy metals, as Dmitry showed me around the largest gambling establishment I'd ever seen on Greenford. One of the more populous and prosperous of the human colonies. And was located nowhere near Jebskir-2. The Borgata on Greenford was a truly enormous establishment and was truly extravagant. But I could not appreciate any of the lavish beauty because Dmitry had insisted that we both get our species' respective versions of heavily intoxicated, and I was focusing intently on not falling over. Sloshed, limp-jawed, pissed, 3 sheets to the wind, I don't care what you call it. Dmitry and I were well and truly in our cups as he threw money around that building. It seemed that for every fistful of money he lost at the tables, he downed another cocktail of alcohol. And he was very insistent that I keep up. He gave me enough spoonfuls of iadkri fruit to make the colored lights in that building drip down the walls. This was all well and good, some simple harmless fun watching a new friend drink their wealth away. That is until Dmitry answered his phone, downed one last drink, and promptly led me to the roof of the building, where we entered a private shuttle bound for orbit. At this point, I fell asleep. When I woke up, I was no longer on the shuttle. I was on a bed, a very soft and very short bed. An excellently furnished stateroom designed for humans. Then, I realized as I sat up and immediately watched the world explode into a rainbow of pain. Headaches, joint aches, stomach aches, every part of my body was the living definition of agony. So, I bravely passed out and slept some more. Eventually, after who knows how much time, Dmitry had one of his butlers come and roused me from my unconsciousness. Food and water helped what remained of the hangovers fade into painful memory, and I began to feel like myself again. I was then brought to Dimitri's lounge on what I was beginning to realize was an extremely large private yacht. "Haltel, you look much better now that you've slept like the dead. How do you feel?" I explained that I felt well enough to never have another bite of Iadkri fruit again, and he merely laughed. The leisurely life of the ultra-rich is a fascinating thing, dear readers. Dimitri would spend hours on end, laying about, relaxing, napping, eating, or simply doing nothing. His business mostly ran itself. And his work, if it can be called that, consisted mostly of talking to lawyers over the phone for a few minutes each day. Then he would congratulate himself on a job well done, have a drink, and retire to his master suite with one or more of the female butlers he employed. Just watching him work so hard at doing so little made me exhausted. We arrived after a mind-numbing amount of time at Operative, a water world. Only humans would establish permanent settlement on a world with no land. Taking a private shuttle down to the largest city on the planet, it occurred to me that I never asked what we were doing on Operative in the first place, or why Dimitri had left so suddenly. "We are going to visit my sister, Alexei Korda," he explained casually before laying down for a nap. A quick search of my files told me that Alexei Korda was the iron-fisted dictator of the planet Operative and its surrounding colonies. The material wealth that the water world hid underneath its vast oceans fueled her wealth and military power. Her rise to power had been accomplished by the violent takeover of the previous laissez-faire democracy that had resisted extensive mining. The people had wanted a more industrious leader, and Alexei gave that to them. Now the planet was wealthy, but the people were still poor. More than one or two whispers of revolution had managed to reach the Gazette's files on the place, so I began to worry about how safe this little vacation really was. Very rarely does one get to land on a private landing platform, step out of a private shuttle, and walk into a palace, greeted by immaculately dressed servants. For all their wild and wandering ways, humans can put on a very tight show when the occasion calls. I suppose if you're a dictator, the occasion is always calling. Alexei greeted us briefly in a cavernous hall, and then escorted Dimitri to a private study where they could discuss family matters. In the few moments I was near her, I was immediately terrified of her. Where Dimitri was certainly slovenly and boorish, he was friendly in his own way, and had little care for business or work. He could always be counted on for a jesting comment or a winning smile. Alexei, to my eye, seemed the complete opposite. She said not two sentences to Dimitri as she pulled him away. And her eyes bored into you with a predatory stare that reminded me more of a soldier than a politician. And if she was capable of smiling, I was sure it could only be a grin of cruelty, probably as she put pins into calculated positions on some small furry creature. The woman was just scary. Watching the two walk away was like watching the night and the day. One casually dressed in a soft robe, the other sternly marching in full military uniform. A servant then showed me to my suite. It's no wonder the wealthiest humans are all thin, they get all their exercise simply walking around their houses. Not only did I get tired walking to the wing where my suite was located, I actually got lost once I was inside it. A modest palace all to itself, my new accommodations consisted of an antechamber, hall, living room, dining room, study, and a bedroom that sprawled through 3 sets of doors, not to mention the closets larger than my house on Massetti Prime, and bathrooms that were closer to spas than any water closet I'd encountered previously. Of course, being on a world mostly made of water, the local style of high-end decoration was with tasteful waterfalls, gently slipping down the marble walls with no discernible sound. I busied myself with answering mail for business, and when that was over, I sat around and watched some human television. Eventually someone came to fetch me for dinner, whereupon Alexei treated Dimitri and me, along with several other apparently important oligarchs and world leaders, to a magnificent dinner of local seafood, along with delicacies from the greater galactic core. I remarked to Alexei that she must have a classically trained parletrix master on her kitchen staff, such was the craftsmanship of the core's dishes. And she replied that her head chef Joshua had studied in the GGC for several years before she insisted that he leave his restaurant and cook for her exclusively. I didn't bother to ask how she had insisted this upon him. Small talk was made, excellent food was had, and refreshments were served. I alternated my time between putting on a good face of enjoying Alexei's sorties, chatting pleasantly with some of the less overbearing guests, and generally orbiting around Dmitry, the only one I considered a friend at the dinner, and the one least likely to imprison me indefinitely. But eventually, Dmitry broke out the cards and the liquor. So I retired to my suite for the evening, the whole time wondering what in the world I was doing here with these people. My editor was clamoring for a new article, and this trip had detained me for so long that I needed to start immediately on something. The next morning I asked Dmitry and Alexei for permission to go exploring the city beyond the palace to find a quick little story so I could keep my job. More bemused than anything else, they said that, of course I had free leave of the grounds and whatever made you think otherwise. I refrained from mentioning the imposing 7-meter wall around the entire complex and the guards that topped it. The city, officially and subtly called Korda City, was very interesting. Arranged like an upside-down J with the palace at the north end and the city sprawling away to the southeast. The buildings became less and less well kept the further from the palace you went. I realized as I walked that if you weren't within sight of the palace, you were basically guaranteed to be destitute. This wasn't a hard realization to come by. There was literally a second wall somewhere along the curve of the city that marked the middle quarter from the rest of the city. And beyond that wall was poverty. I began a routine. Wake up in Palace Korda, entertain breakfast with my hosts, and talk briefly with the other guests, then go out into the city and walk or take public transit further southwest than I'd been the day before. This probably wasn't the smartest thing to do, but I was desperate for a story, and interesting characters make interesting articles. It took 4 days for me to reach the southernmost tip of the city, and the view from the harbor quay at the tip was staggering. Hundreds of ships, each larger than the last, queued up to unload their ores and minerals, lined the horizon from edge to edge. I sat with a foreman over lunch and asked about the operation. Each ship there comes from a different mine, each a small city in its own right. The heavily tanned man told me between bites of his dripping sandwich. From there we unload the contents into prefab containers and load those containers onto the elevator, where they get sorted and shipped up in orbit. The space elevator of Korda was the only one on the planet, and it only handled unpressurized materials. No passengers were ever transported on it. I suspected that this was a security measure, and also a way of keeping people from fleeing off-world. In actuality, the only visible signs of the government being oppressive was the heavily militarized and highly visible police force and the extremely low wages mandated by the government, which held de facto control over nearly all aspects of the economy. No one seemed willing to talk to me expressly about the situation when I asked, except for that foreman. It's downright criminal. You haven't been here long enough to see the things they've done to us. The secret police storming houses in the night, the random searches on the street. They think that because they have the guns, they can keep all us down. We outnumber them by 7,000 to 1. It's not going to stand for long. Keep that in mind as you go back to that palace tonight, buddy. And with those ominous words, I went back to Palace Korda. 2 trains, one falling apart at the axles and one brand new, took me to the steps of the massive building. Inside, preparations were well underway for the ball Alexei was throwing for her guests, and it was looking to be the largest such event I'd seen at the palace, or anywhere else for that matter. Hundreds of wealthy, rich, or merely important individuals were flocking to the palace from all over the sector, in expensive cars, private shuttles, and even showing off their wealth on a planet with no terra firma, by arriving in carriages drawn by dray animals. Everywhere I turned, there seemed to be a more extravagantly dressed couple than the last, and works of art on prominent display were each more priceless than the last. The feast was historic, the liquor flowed like water from the walls, and everywhere you looked, indulgence was the game of the hour. Dmitry introduced me to no less than 7 of his cousins, each the owner of a different asteroid claim somewhere. Room after room of industry barons and oligarchs, a sheik, 4 dukes, 3 duchesses. More princesses than I can remember, 2 prime ministers, 1 extra prime minister that was so drunk she forgot her own title and introduced herself as president. And even the head of a theocracy were shown to me throughout the evening. People got roaring drunk, dresses tore, punches were thrown and then forgiven. The whole event was a bigger, more out of control mess than I could have imagined. I personally walked in on 8 couples and 1 group of 5 in the midst of intimate moments over the course of the evening while searching for an unoccupied room to get some peace and quiet. 1 couple even asked me to join them. I politely declined. Humans don't often cut completely loose, and they rarely have the resources to do so with such vigor, but when they do, I suggest you stay sober and far away. So it went, and just as everything started to settle a little, the whole world came crashing down around me. I was somewhere on the 3rd floor, on a balcony getting some air, when out in the harbor in front of me, one of the large water-borne yachts launched an enormous green flare. Everyone, myself included, mistook this for a firework, a large pyrotechnic explosion intended for entertainment, at first. But slowly word got around that there was no fireworks display planned for the evening, and I started to get suspicious. My suspicion was confirmed when as I walked around the party looking for Dimitri, I instead found Alexei, completely sober somehow, talking very urgently to her head of security. Then they both disappeared into her villa. Right at that moment as the doors to her rooms were closing, I had the most perfect view of the landing platform, as every single shuttle on it fell away into the sea, as the platform sheared off from the rest of the city in a series of dull thumps and bright flashes. From the top of the stairs, I had no idea what was happening out front of the party, but it must have been something terrible, because waves of people were pressing in towards main hall from the front doors, as the people who had just witnessed the demolition of the shuttle pad started to run forward. These 2 great masses of people collided on a dance floor, and complete panicked chaos was unleashed upon the party. Seeing how the only sensible thing would be to move away from the crowd of dangerous, terrified drunks, I ran to the windows that overlooked the front of the building. To say that a mob had formed would be an understatement. This was not your run-of-the-mill gathering of angry people. If there was a person living in Corda City that was not rioting and carrying some heavy object, I would be very surprised. The crowd was at an angry standoff with a giant line of armed police forces, somehow already mobilized and ready to fend off the mob. On the top of the walls were even more troops, each with a few different weapons at their disposal. Right now they were launching chemical smoke deep into the crowd, and even from behind, inside the house, I could smell the sting in the air. Further in the distance, it looked like there was less control of the crowd than I had first guessed. Once you saw past the organized and stalwart front lines that occupied the square, the city proper was a different story. Bonfires raged in streets, houses burned, and looting the nicer homes seemed to be more the point than any political statement. A group smaller in number than the large force out front of the palace, but better armed, was climbing the walls of the relatively undefended state house and launching flaming bottles at windows. It was then I realized what my problem was. I was inside the palace, where the angry mob wanted to be, and once they were in, there was no way to protect myself. Just as panic gripped me, I felt a strong hand on my shoulder. "Haltel. Get away from the window, man," Dimitri yelled, as he dragged me back into the corridor, as streams of screaming partygoers ran past in every direction. He bundled me down the stairs, across halls, and through the guests, sometimes using force to get them out of our way, always moving us to the eastward wing. Somewhere in the distance the sound of rifle fire sounded in jagged bursts, and a monumental roar came up from outside. People inside the building were going absolutely crazy, grabbing art, food, drugs, and other people, even as they scattered, panicking. There was really no place for them to run. The palace was built on the far end of the city, and there was only one land entrance, and it was blocked by the mob. Dimitri didn't seem too concerned, however, and as the last bits of rifle fire sputtered to a halt, he stopped at an unassuming door. He opened it via some sort of DNA lock and stepped inside, pulling me with him. As he was about to close the door behind us, I caught a glimpse out the front windows, now being shattered by the horde of people. Uprooted paving stones came through the glass, followed by people waving heavy pipes or stolen rifles. One woman in an impractical ball gown tripped and fell, crying at the entrance to our room, begging for a place to hide. Dimitri took one look at her, made a face, and slammed the door closed, only hear a scream, as her hand blocked the door with a crunch. Dimitri kicked at her broken hand until she recoiled in pain, and he could finally close it. "What was that? What are you doing? What are we doing?" I shouted at him, completely certain that my life was going to end any second now. He ignored me and angrily closed 3 locks on the door. Somewhere above our heads, some giant guns started firing, the deafening buzz audibly chewing through the structure of the palace. Someone was banging on the door to the room. And then nearby gunshots silenced the knocking. When I looked away from the door, Dimitri was preparing a small speedboat for launch from some sort of mechanized floor built into the room. The floor opened underneath the boat and he moved over to the edge. I started to move to the boat too, but Dimitri angrily threw me to the ground. "Family only. Just stay in the safe room. You'll be fine," he shouted, one fist raised threateningly. I stayed on the ground as he jumped in the boat, and I didn't move as metal cables lowered it into the ocean before separating and spinning back up. I hadn't had the heart to tell him that someone had drilled holes in the bottom of his fancy escape boat. I lay on the ground for a while longer, listening to the enormous gun continue to chew away upstairs. After several moments there was a loud pounding at the door, and on the third hit the locks came out of the wood and the door flew open. 3 angry, blood-spattered humans with rags over their faces, each brandishing stolen police rifles. They paused when they found no cowering rich people in the room and seemed to be puzzled by the sight of one very tired alien reporter on the floor and a large rectangular hole in the floor. A 4th human came through the door, hefting the homemade battering ram that had opened it. He looked at me and laughed, then pulled the mask down off his bearded face. "No, no, no." The dock foreman shook his head as he chuckled to himself. "What in the world are you doing, buddy?" I simply looked up at him and shrugged. He leaned over the hole in the floor. "Is that Dimitri Korda down there, knee-deep in that sinking boat with no power?" "Yes it is. He's the one who put me in this room." The foreman laughed to himself. No one will find him. And serves him right for the way he's treating those miners out there on Jebskirt. The foreman stepped away from the edge and offered me his hand, which I took because there were no other options that I could see. He hauled me up to my feet and motioned the small group out of the room and into the chaos. "Stay close to me, buddy," he said as we emerged into the fight. If I thought the mansion was nigh on a disaster area before I entered the room, it was surely one now. Entire walls were demolished. The bodies of rich and poor alike lay all over, some still rolling, and moaning, and bleeding. Occasional bursts of heavy fire from 3 stories up would crash through the ceiling, sending friend and foe alike scattering for cover. Not that the wielders seemed to care about either. Groups of rebels huddled together in corners, away from the sight of the military and police forces that had taken up residence in some of the rooms and halls. Screams still echoed down the halls, but they were shorter solo performances, rather than the chorus of voices that filled the halls not even an hour ago. "We're going out a side entrance for you, buddy. We want to stay away from crazy Alexi and her 30 cal upstairs," the foreman said as we moved down the hall quickly to a side window against a garden. Individual scenes of revolution were visible even outside the building as we dropped out a window. People chased each other in 1s or 2s, and a small firefight had broken out in a far corner of the property, between a few teenagers and an elderly man with huge grey whiskers and a left breast full of medals. From there, we went out a gate in the wall, which turned out to be surprisingly easy to do in the correct company. The foreman took me over the transit station, where the train was still running, despite the chaos. As we boarded the otherwise empty rail car, he relaxed a little and sat down to watch the chaos in the palace across the square. Someone had gotten fed up and set fire to the west wing of the house, and it wouldn't be too long before the rest went up too. When the train pulled away, he spoke again, softer now that we were away from the fighting. I know that you don't have all the information about all the things they did to us. So I am not going to ask you to write about our cause or why what we did was right. I didn't say anything as we passed over burning houses and looted stores. I don't even want you to write about any of this, to be honest. But I know you have to write something, and this is certainly a story. So, I'll just ask you to keep in mind that we think we're doing the right thing in all this. And yes, terrible things happened, murder and rape and all the other atrocities of revolution. He waved his hand as if dismissing these things as merely part of the process. But I think it's worth it. To rid the worlds of those monsters, I'll gladly blacken my soul if it means my children will never know their kind. He meant it too, that much was obvious, and not just from the blood on his clothes and hands. I just sort of half-heartedly agreed and looked out the window. When we transferred trains, he commented. You know, the really ironic thing is that they forced us to build our homes with cheap materials. Metal, prefab stuff. But their homes with the fancy wood and glass are the ones burning. We've got nothing to fear from the fires. I guess that's irony, anyway. Never went to school. Eventually, we reached the space elevator, and he had some guys put me into a custom-made pressurized cargo box that they were using to smuggle high-priority revolutionaries on and off-world, and they sent me up to the station in orbit. From there, I paid my way back to the more developed human sectors on a cargo vessel. As we started accelerating out of the gravity well of Operative a few days later, well after the last of the old governments had been found and ended, including Alexei and her machine gun, and I had read up properly on all the terrible things that had been committed over the past decade by those people. I looked down at the planet and saw the still burning outline of Corda City against the inky black ocean. And I knew that somewhere in that cold sea, Dimitri's body was unrecovered somewhere. Then I closed the shade over the window and I smiled a sad little smile and had just one spoonful of Iadkri fruit in the memory of a monster. May your futures be brighter than each yesterday, dear readers. Haltel Valken, Xenoculture Correspondent, Massetti Prime Gazette. Author's name and the link to original text is in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video.